session. And just say welcome, everybody. Great to have you back. We are on our last 2 weeks of this series on grace in our political conversations. And today we are going to be talking about getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? Which we all love to do. So I want to congratulate all of you for being here on this call today. That is one of the big challenges of the faithful life is a willingness to get uncomfortable, because that's where our faith grows. That's where our relationship with God happens. That's where we have to actually trust in God for real. It's in those moments of discomfort. So with us today to help us explore this is Hunter Torres. So without any other further ado, Hunter, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And hi, everybody. It's really nice to be with you today. I've been away with a big work project for a long time, and this happened to coincide right after I finished it, and it just feels really great to see you all. Can you see the PowerPoint slides that I shared? Excellent. Good. I don't know how many of you had the chance to read or listen to this chapter, but I found it to be packed full of ideas. And so I have a lot to think through with you today, and I really look forward to this conversation. I picked this particular topic among those that were available because I thought I'm pretty good at being uncomfortable, right? I think this is a skill set I've perfected. And I bet if I read this chapter, I'll find out how not true that is. And so I really did learn a lot, and I want to share with you some of the takeaways. I found it to be really enlightening. Um, I think it's a dense chapter. I don't know if you experience the same. There's a lot in it, and you have to really pay attention. You have to keep your mind on the thread as you go deep into topics like the opioid crisis and keep backing up and saying, wait a minute, what is this about? And so I had an opportunity to listen to it on Audible a number of times. And what I found was that was a good approach because there's so much in here that it was worth multiple listens. And I recommend multiple reads or multiple listens to you. It's really full of wisdom. I tried to extract some of that for us today. I think that the essential premise here in this chapter that the authors are offering to us is the notion that our everyday lives have been made for us in our first world country today pretty comfortable, and arguably too comfortable, because the truth is it's very uncomfortable to reckon with the forces at play in our time. And so if what we've gotten very good at is living comfortably with discomfort removed, it becomes a real challenge for us to talk with each other around things that are inherently uncomfortable. To do that, we have to reorient our whole expectation on what that should feel like and what it could look like. We have to get familiar again with what does it mean to practice passionate argument without hurting each other. Um, I like this quotation. We have to become better thinkers, more articulate speakers, more earnest listeners through the daily discomfort of engaging with each other about difficult subjects. But the real essence of it to me that I kept looking for and pulling through my understanding of the chapter was that to choose to overcome our most base instincts for the health of our country is at its core a spiritual practice. And I think that to take that nugget out, you have to really be intentional in your reading. And I want to try to draw that out for us. This is one notion that, wait a minute, we're struggling perhaps because we thought this work of engaging with each other was meant to be easy. And the authors suggest, no, it's really not. In a culture where scientific and technological and commercial advances made our lives so comfortable, we have this misguided belief perhaps that civic discourse should be comfortable. And we begin to see the cost of our failure to really effectively engage with each other. But I think the hopeful notion of this chapter is that when we figure out how to embark on this kind of a journey together, that even though it's not comfortable a lot of the time, there's really great reward. So what I want to do with our time with you and your thoughts and our engagement through Zoom is first quickly summarize the author's thesis of how did we even get to this position? And then back out a little bit to look at that moment that we're in through the lens, our common lens of faith. And then I want to challenge us to investigate the notion of what does it mean to get comfortable with being uncomfortable by taking us through 5 really short reflections and then finalize with 5 ways we might aspire to get better at it together. So, the staggering price of avoiding discomfort. Seems I liked 5s as I thought about this. Here are 5 areas where we are paying a price by training ourselves to just be too comfortable. The first is the physical. So most of us have entertained some kind of physical regime or avoided it or approached it or both. Their whole industries built up around the notion that, yeah, we don't really like feeling the pain of exercise. And yet we know that discomfort sometimes is actually what helps us get stronger and heal more, not pain, but discomfort. The chapter of the book spends a whole lot of time on the opioid crisis as another example of our desire to avoid physical pain. And that's covered in a lot of depth. I'll talk a little bit about that more, but then bring it even to a even broader spread issue of the pandemic. We know that our desire to avoid physical pain has created comorbidities that show up in our tragic results of the current pandemic. From the physical to the mental, I would say, do you have a teenager, like I do, to remind us of how our screens and media platforms have made it even easier to distract ourselves from discomfort? But you don't have to have a teenager. You have to maybe look at yourself. I know I do. How often do I turn without thinking to distract myself by looking at the latest headline? I walk by any window and see people or any train car or any place, see us all engaged first with our screens as a type of mental discomfort avoidance. The cost of that, pretty high. You might argue cost of more reading, more conversation, more discourse. And if you really imagine the cost of our willingness to avoid mental discomfort by anesthetizing ourselves, is the cost of productivity, of creative outputs that we are choosing to forego. You can see each of these gets a little deeper. The relational. Have you been married for a day, a year? Have you noticed how you always have the choice to move toward or away from discomfort? But it is indeed in discomfort that our relationships are made deeper. And it's not only through marriage. I have 2 relationships in my life where, because I'm not bound to them, I have chosen comfort rather than work and moved away from the relationships. And it's pain, it's grieving me, right? I wonder in your lives whether you notice where comfort and discomfort enter into your choices about relationships. Okay, now we're going really big. Existential. My stepfather, whom I loved very much, was so afraid of reckoning with his own death that he left a lot of messes that cost a lot of people a lot of hurt. So he's just one example of all of us, afraid to look at our mortality and to tend to the uncomfortable work of healing relationships and leaving our lives in order. And we can go bigger still to look at our discomfort with our relationship with our planet and all of the costs of that. Today's sermon really spoke to this to me, right? Of, are we willing to keep re-engaging in the transformational work that is often uncomfortable of reckoning with our faith? It's so powerful. So lest you feel like you need to exit the Zoom because this is just so depressing, I want to really quickly move us away from that notion. It's not meant to be this self-flagellating diatribe. I just wanted to take out of the chapter what I felt was the range of examples that we were offered to say, you know what, we come by our fear of and failure in political conversation with each other pretty honestly. We've trained ourselves well to move away from things that feel like they don't have easy answers and that are hard. Look at this input of all of these areas of our lives. It makes sense that in talking with each other about these vast divides in our views and our values, we look for good guys and bad guys. We look for heroes and villains. We look to make the complex as simple as possible to make it more comfortable. We choose media outlets who are very willing to help us do just that. Because if we don't, the answer might not feel good. And there might not be one person or one group to blame, and there might not be a way to predict an outcome we know we'll like. So the authors posit that we need to get better at accepting a greater level of discomfort in our bodies and our minds and our culture, because if we don't do that, we lose the sense, and I think this is really important, we lose the sense that fundamentally we're okay if we're uncomfortable, that we have to be secure and resilient in the notion that we can reach out to our neighbors in the spirit of solving problems for the greater good, and we will be okay, even though it's uncomfortable. When we don't, and we stay in our corners, and we stay away from everything that doesn't have a predictable plot line that makes sense to our values, we perish, we really suffer. At the heart of the challenge, say the authors, we need to make room for more complexity. We need to tolerate ambiguity, and we need to redefine our relationship with conflict. I want to start with the idea of complexity, going back to that opioid topic in which they spend so much time presenting, I think essentially as an example of here's a complex problem. Here's one where not only are the numbers really staggering, but they point to some very uncomfortable truths. They point to the fact that the opioid crisis in our country is an epidemic born of racism, born of corporate greed, born of our own failure to perceive pain as tolerable and within our control. And those are some really gnarly things, right? It's really hard to dissect and figure out how to address and how to speak to each other and to the humans involved in this particular epidemic in ways that find solutions. So that's an example of complexity. And reading this chapter, you have to be willing then to extrapolate from that deep exploration of the opioid crisis to say, well, how does that fit with what we're talking about around political discourse? And to me, it's that you have to be willing to tackle things that have no easy answers and tolerate, make room for the fact that there's a lot of ambiguity, and we have to be able to embrace ambiguity if we're going to make any progress together. Essentially, both those ideas, complexity and ambiguity, point to the need to redefine our relationship with conflict. I'm going to take you back to Friendsgiving last year. I've got a friend who's got political ideas that are really far from mine. And this is a group of people who love each other. We were allowed to be around the table. There was fondue of all variety. And the friend started into something, and I lit up like, oh boy, this will be good. I'm going to explore this. And another friend, he's Argentine, he looked at me with just terror in his eyes, and he said, don't go there, don't go there. Like, don't go there. Here's this wonderful time we're having. Please don't go to this uncomfortable thing of the fact that our one friend is such an outlier politically to us. And I thought, wow, are we so afraid of this little bit of conflict together? I looked upon it as a bit of fun with care, but the authors remind us that conflict is essential. That's how we overcome groupthink. Social scientists tell us conflict's how we get to innovation. It's how we get scientific breakthrough. It's how we preserve democracy, right? What a topic for our time, that conflict is healthy and necessary, and that working through difficult topics and emotions moves us toward greater maturity, wisdom and peace. That's a quotation from the book. There are so many, by the way. If you were to take that book with a notebook, that chapter, there's just so many pieces like that. That when we grow our ideas and when we look at our ideas about policy and problems and we challenge them, we become better thinkers, more articulate speakers, more earnest listeners through daily discomfort of engaging with others about difficult subjects. And if we don't, we stay in our corners in arrested development. So, lest this all become too heady, I wanted to go back and say, well, how does that connect with faith? And I think you have to look for it throughout this chapter, but I think it's clear that to embrace the notion of grace-filled political conversation is to embrace the notion that only God holds the real answers, that our conversations are just at our level, and that God wants us to do the work of reckoning with each other to heal our wounds, and that a divided, distracted, anesthetized people is not what God wants for us. So that we have to reckon even with our relationship with God as we look for a redeeming path forward. And I thought today's sermon issued an invitation around transformation by letting go of control. So I pulled a few quotations from the chapter where they're dotted through about faith, and I'll offer them here, see if you agree. I want you to notice when the font gets bigger is when I was like, yeah, really. So the first one, disconnecting ourselves from our pain points automatically disconnects us from other people. I spend too much time disconnecting from pain points, I think. And as a result, I do feel more disconnected. These moments lead to a crisis of faith if we really investigate them. Sometimes we need to challenge our faith and our understanding of God. Bigger font. God is as outraged as we are. Is that not something you might hear from the pulpit at our church, right? Manisha, that's her voice. God is as outraged as we are, and even bigger. God is the only complete witness to our pain. That's why I like this chapter, because I think, how could you talk on one hand about this academic review of an opioid crisis and then sneak in there this statement, God is the only complete witness to our pain? This one just knocks me over. So I want to turn to the personal for us. I want to just pause that for a minute and say, I took 5 short reflections from the chapter, and they're reflections on how do we get more comfortable with being uncomfortable. And for each of them, I'm going to read them out loud and invite each of you into a quiet, private reflection for a short time. And by short time, I mean maybe 30 seconds, which probably feels like 30 minutes on a Zoom with this many people. So maybe if you don't have a place right now to write something down or jot something down, take a second and get it, because I would think this would be the best used if you have a minute to reflect, have a way to. I'm going to start with the first two. I'm going to pump the well by sharing what I came up with when I reflected a bit, just to show you the direction we're going, but I'll turn them quickly back to you. So the first one, what discomforts do you avoid in life? And first, I'll show you some of the things that came up for me. I tried to be really honest with you. Okay, so take those away and give you a moment to ask yourself, what discomforts do you avoid in life? And you won't be asked to share them. You don't need to. This is really meant to be private reflection. I don't know about for you, but for me, it's a little uncomfortable to think about the discomforts that I avoid. What do you use? You see, I capitalized the word use to put some distance between yourself and those things that cause you the most discomfort. So here are some of the things I use. The lattes, I put chocolate drizzle on top. So I'll take mine away and turn it back to you. What do you use to put distance between yourself and the things that cause you the most discomfort? My hope is that by taking a moment, reflecting on what we use to relieve some discomfort might cause us the next time we're doing that to just have a bit of awareness, right? And maybe ask ourselves, is that really what we want? Is that what God wants for us right then? And maybe it is, maybe it's not. This one I won't offer my own, but I'll tell you the high level that I took away from it. What discomforts do you avoid in conversation? As I reflect on this, I realized I don't really. I only avoid discomfort that might cause someone irreparable harm. I wonder, what discomforts do you avoid?
Hunter, one of the comments in the chat was whether our responses can include our various coping mechanisms. And I think your answer would be yes to that.
You know it. I think that's actually a great word to use to frame this. What are we doing when we're trying to avoid discomfort? We're trying to cope with a world that gives us so many opportunities to feel the feelings that we do, which we'll get to again in just a moment around that notion of feelings. This question, what relationships could not withstand disagreement, is one that spoke to me a lot when I mentioned the two relationships that I feel are really fractured in my life, that I've allowed to stay that way. This question challenged me to say, do I really think so little of those relationships that they couldn't withstand the journey of disagreement and some kind of recovery? So I wonder, in your lives, are there relationships where disagreement really does break them? Or is there any other way to look at it?
It's interesting, Hunter, to this question. You could ask, what is the model that we are given in Scripture, right? And in Scripture, over and over again, we see disagreements between very faithful people about their faith, about what God would have them do in a given moment. Disagreements with God, disagreements with God's outcome, with reality. The Psalms are filled with it. Job is filled with it. Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount says, you've read in Scripture this. Well, I say this. Scripture is replete with disagreements amongst faithful people.
That's excellent. Here's this last reflection. What are you unwilling to feel? Unwilling is such an interesting word that I took from the chapter, but I put in my mind as well, what am I afraid to feel? What am I just so avoidant of feeling? What is so uncomfortable a feeling that I work so hard, that I go so far out of my way to not feel it? So that's really sacred territory, I think. You can go a lot of directions with it. One direction around this conversation today is to say, what are we so afraid of feeling with each other that we can't have conversations where we run into what seems like a brick wall? There are some conversations where I'm afraid of feeling ignorant, not well studied enough on a topic, or I'm afraid of feeling hateful or just locked down. So there are lots of places you can go with it, but all of these reflections are really meant to take us to what I would see as a bit of a summary that I'll offer before we go into what might we try differently. So if you were to take away the notion of all these reasons why we have learned and taught and practiced staying comfortable, and all these ways where we try to avoid feeling and we treat our relationships as so fragile, then here are some of the reasons why we are working too hard to avoid and mask discomfort. Maybe we should allow a little bit more of it to be apparent. We are regarding all conflict as bad, and maybe we should regard it as a tool. We're underestimating the durability of our relationships, and maybe that's a notion worth challenging. We aspire to persuade rather than to listen and learn. I think I'm super guilty of that one, like all day long. And we hope only to feel good. Nothing wrong with that, but what if what we feel is a little unsettled, a little unsure, a little needy, a little unresolved? So, I'm a business consultant. So, what I should now put is okay, so here are the 5 best practices. And I thought, well, that's a bunch of horseshit. Let me just say, what are some things we could try? Because I don't know what best practices are in this. And those come down to the question of how do we want to be? Who do we want to be in our world together? So here are 5 areas of ways to try. And I'm going to point out a couple things that really jumped out for me. The one is we should be alert in our conversations with each other around when are we being avoidant? When are we oversimplifying and pushing ourselves into absolutisms and looking at heroes and villains? The heroes and villains thing is a strong one in our time. We need to take care, and I appreciate that the authors really raised this notion of the difference between discomfort and pain. We need to take care in our language with each other. We need to take a beat before responding in a harsh or negative way and take in what's been said. And we need to be mindful that we are not meaning to cause pain to each other. We are meaning to utilize a bit of discomfort, to allow a bit of discomfort to advance to another plane. Ask and listen first. These are, frankly, some best practices. I'll go ahead and call them that, right? Have you ever just tried, instead of responding with your point, which we're all dying to do, to respond with a question instead that gives the other person one more opportunity to share more of what they think so that you might learn more and then not argue their point, but here, and this is, I underline it because I think it's such a radical and exciting notion. What if your conversation was meant to not come to resolution, not share your view, but to discover the other person's journey to their view? And that's it. What if for that day, that's it? Anytime I've ever had the good grace to do that, I have been rewarded with a new view of a person, with a new understanding of a worldview. It's just powerful. So I've found that one to be useful to me. Committing to kindness. This is a big notion in this chapter. That if we look at those whom we do not know or with whom we do not agree as friends first, and that if we challenge ourselves to not hold back love, how often, I'm going to just say this is true for me, I hold back love a lot. And I underlined this last one, replace unhelpful thoughts, because I thought it was such a great idea. I was walking the dog yesterday, and there is a house that I love down the street. They have a banner that I do not love. And I had this instinct that I was surprised by. I wanted to spit at it. That's so not like me, right? I was like, whoa, where did that come from? It was so base. And the notion in the book was replace the unhelpful thought with a really radically different one. What if I looked at that house and its inhabitants with love, and I did not hold back my love for them in spite of their banner, which I detest everything about? That's really different. And I want my kids to experience that, not the mom who wants to spit on somebody else's political banner. Back to the spiritual, that is, I think, at the essence of all of this, that this is a spiritual practice, that when we do not agree, that is only such a small part of us. And that I love this idea. The only place to really take our true, deep disagreement, rage, dissatisfaction, crushing sense of woe is prayer. That frees us up to have all the rest of it be with each other. I have one more quotation and one more recommendation. If you read the chapter, you will have come upon this. The world is too dangerous for anything but truth and too small for anything but love. I thought those were good guiding words. And lastly, before turning it over to conversation, I wanted to just recommend to you something, if you haven't seen it, which I think is doing the very thing we're talking about. It's called the National Conversation Project, and they encourage people to host and participate in conversations around difficult topics with people whose views are not like their own, as a way to practice this spiritual path of learning to love each other in our disagreement and heal our wounds together. So with that, I will thank you. We'll stop sharing and turn it back to the group.
Hunter, that was profound. Thank you for that. I too read that chapter, and it was, wow, this has got a lot. In fact, this chapter alone, each one of your bullets could have been a forum topic, right? Yeah. Thoughts, responses. How did this hit you, folks?
You have to unmute everybody.
You can unmute yourself, as you just did.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'll tell you the one. I'll just start and share. There was so much there, but one of the ones I wrote down was this idea of avoiding the desire to persuade, and try to substitute that with an effort to understand. And to me, that's almost at the heart of this for me. And I preached on it a couple of weeks ago. It occurred to me as I was reflecting on this during the quiet time, that persuasion in our culture is, I think, valued as kind of power. It means we've made progress. We've achieved something. We've brought someone over to our side. There's a kind of power implied in that idea that's valued in our culture. And it occurs to me that understanding is not equally valued. That is almost about, that's a passive, that's a kind of a weakness. That's almost a surrender I'm listening to them and I'm somehow surrendering to their ideas by taking the time to understand them. So it just occurs to me that this valuing, how we value those two things, is a cultural challenge as we engage in this work. Other thoughts, other responses, other aha moments. Yeah, go ahead, Leslie.
Leslie.
Well, Hunter, that was terrific. Thank you. But the question, what are you afraid of? And I got stuck on, I'm afraid of being wrong. And I think we're all afraid of being wrong. And all the embarrassment or shame or whatever it is that comes along with that. It's different for different people, but that's a scary one. And I'm afraid of being enraged, like when you saw your neighbor's banner. I don't like being enraged at my neighbors. Makes me very uncomfortable.
Especially if they know about it.
That example gave me brought to mind a neighborhood, two houses in my neighborhood. One has all kinds of Trump signs still up in their yard, and the person next to them have posted all of these signs directly at their house, Black Lives Matter and all this other stuff. They're having this war of signage. And each week I walk by, more are added to it. It's like this, nuclear arms race of yelling at each other through their signs. And your example, Hunter, made me think, what if, rather than this escalation of signage warfare, what if one of them were to surrender to that and instead walk over, take down their own signs, and polish and straighten the signs of the other? Isn't that a radical vision of the kingdom of God? As uncomfortable as you say, Leslie.
My solution has often been just to play the ostrich, bury my head in the sand or under the pillow and tune out and withdraw from the whole conversation, because I don't like the confrontation and I don't see any way to end it.
I want to go back to the beginning of the discussion on recognizing the discomfort in ourselves and others. And I think for me, I can pretty much recognize my discomfort, probably more so than I can recognize it in somebody else. And I guess, excuse me.
She took the call.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So, where was I? And then you said that discomfort can bring comfort. And so, I go back to what I'm about to approach, what I'm coming into very soon, which would be the anniversary of my son. And I don't know how the discomfort of his death is bringing me comfort. It hasn't brought me comfort yet. And so, I hide behind this mask. I have the clown, the face of a clown. And these, other than my children, only one other person recognized this in me and can see through that mask. And that's my good Christian friend, Eric Linder. He said, "How are you doing?" And I'm always going, "Oh, I'm fine." And he goes, "Stop it. No, you're not fine." And no, I'm not fine, but I don't let it out and I don't let on to anybody else that I'm not fine. And I guess the other thing that I kind of disagree with is you said disconnect ourselves from our pain, and we disconnect from other people. And I think as we just try to disconnect from our pain, at least for me, I'm connecting with other people to get through this pain, by busying myself and helping others. And I know right after my son, which was in December, the last closing we had for him, which would be the burial, was on the 17th of December. Well, I still had my Christmas brunch to do. And while everybody was saying, okay, I'm going to take this over for you. No, I don't want you to take this over for me. I need to be as busy as I can be. And so I did the Christmas brunch that year. So I cannot disconnect from people.
But there was a little bit in the chat around coping mechanisms. I know that question was raised, and the comment that some coping mechanisms are really helpful and healthy and some are not. And it sounds like you have found one that works really well for you.
And some have a shelf life. There's a purpose for a time. There's a season for a particular coping mechanism. And I wonder, Amy, if you might, I literally love that point. And I think it's a helpful one. For example, Carolyn's comment that, her coping mechanism, if I could paraphrase, is to withdraw right now. They're just too hard, some of these conversations. That's an appropriate response, isn't it, at times?
Yes, very much so. And I think it's a healthy response. It's a protective response. It's what you need at this given moment. Where it becomes difficult is if you grow and move on, but still fall back on that particular coping mechanism in times that it isn't the best thing for you, or it's not necessarily needed. And I think many people, or I know that I can relate to that. There are times where for me to cope, I've had to, much like Hunter said, take a huge step back from certain people in my life who probably needed me very much at that time, but I couldn't continue in my own life with that particular burden at that time. So my coping mechanism was to take a big step back. But then I found myself taking a big step back from everybody to avoid feeling discomfort. And that's not healthy. And that's not the best, wasn't the best thing for me. And so I think being able to know yourself to say when a coping mechanism is helpful and when it's not, and when it's an actual protective factor for you and when it's not.
Yeah.
And I think, Hunter, your exercise is an excellent by having us really think about those questions and examine what we are doing and aren't doing, to think about maybe what some of coping mechanisms that weren't helpful aren't currently helpful, but were helpful in the past. And maybe it's time to think about something different. Is a great exercise to identify those.
But if you're saying that we are avoiding, and I think this was one of them too, our discomfort, are we really helping ourselves by doing that?
Yes, I think you can help yourself for that. Sometimes that's what your body needs. We have a very physiological response to discomfort, which could be a whole nother section, but really we don't like discomfort because our heart starts to race, our mind gets unclear, we may get sweaty palms. We have a very physiological response to arguments or things that make us angry, much like Hunter's desire to spit at the sign, right? There can be a very primal physiological response. And sometimes we get overactivated. Our nervous system is overactivated, and avoidance is the best way in some circumstances to re-regulate the nervous system and to take care of your body in that moment. And so I wouldn't call what you're doing avoiding. I would call it managing your grief in the way that feels right and best for you at this time. And that's okay. That's okay.
I think that grief is such a great example, Shirley, of a kind of discomfort that requires such special care, and that there's such a variety of ways that we can care for ourselves in it, and that there are different coping mechanisms for different times in that journey. And I speak to that from my own experience, where there was a time when, after my dad had died, when I must have wrapped myself in so much gauze just to be able to put one foot in front of the other, that my self told me when it was time to loosen that a little bit. I was walking in an airport, going to something for work, and I suddenly felt like I'd been stabbed in the gut. And I think it was, and I stopped in the middle of the concourse and I just burst into tears. But I think that was one step in a grief journey, saying, okay, you need to take some of this gauze off, right? I had stepped away from my home where I had to tend my kids and had a moment of place that myself said, next step in the journey has arrived. So I think that there are lots of ways. And Amy, I really agree with you that protective coping mechanisms have their place, and grief is one of them, especially early grief.
Yeah, it strikes me that the topic is grace-filled conversations. And that topic of grace, as I recall, when we summarized that chapter, the first place to extend that grace is to yourself. And to the points that are being raised here, that we're not, it strikes me that when we think about our coping mechanisms, maybe the key is to have the self-awareness that we're relying on it right now. And that might be enough to just know that about yourself. You know what? This is my coping mechanism right now. And I'm going to give myself grace to rely on it. But I'm not going to mistake it for who I am. I'm not going to mistake it for my end person that God made me to be. I'm just going to know that this is what I need to do right now. I think there's an important distinction there.
I agree. No one coping mechanism is perfect for every situation, for every moment or time in your life, or for every person.
I'm looking at Leslie's chat that says, recalls a professor who said, people don't come to psychotherapy with problems, they come with solutions, but the solutions aren't working for them anymore. So solutions are those coping mechanisms that have lived past their lifespan and need to be adjusted. There's also another very interesting comment in the chat that I'd like to shift us to a little bit, because I think that what we're talking about is so deeply personal, our relationship with discomfort, our willingness to engage, but it's also super practical. How, when we ever, God willing, find ourselves in coffee hour in person again, how do we do better lingering just a little bit longer on conversations of difficult topics? And so, Barry, you asked, what's the difference between feeding those who are hungry for knowledge and persuading them? How do we really look at that question of talking with each other, not to persuade, but to listen and learn and to share and exchange information? I appreciated the question. I wonder what you all think about that. I see some back and forth here on the chat about, oh, and then a good one of tell me what it is you want to know, or tell me more. There are all those good questions, but persuading for me is when I get locked down into something that I'm pretty sure must be the only and right way to look at a topic. I've been doing this with my own family about COVID safety. I have a daughter who very much wants to experience normal life as a 14-year-old and is very eager to have her friend come to our house. And I'm saying, but look, this is the information we have that tells us that is not okay. And I get so locked into what I'm pretty sure is the only way to interpret that information, and trying to persuade my child to understand and accept that, and my husband to stand with me on it. And I just put myself in this corner of needing to persuade where nobody else can possibly have a view that it can measure up to fact. Do you all find yourselves in a position like that, whether it's that topic or others, where you're just determined that surely you will be successful in persuading because there's no other way to see it?
Well, Hunter, my response to your particular situation, I don't have people who are as close to me, well, maybe one, my sister, as your daughters and your husband are to you. I think you should cut yourself a little bit of slack here. You may think that you're, taking the Custer's last stand position, but it's because you love them. I know that's complexity, but your motives have a great deal of good in them too, I would say.
Well, I think also, Hunter, you have facts on your side. And I find myself, it's easier for me to talk to people about policy differences when I have facts on my side. But when facts are on my side and the other person doesn't have facts on their side, then it's more difficult for me. And I guess we're all talking about feeling vulnerable, and nobody likes to feel vulnerable because we've been taught that's a weakness. We need to be strong. We need to model strength for other people. We need to be able to support people and be strong. But it's that was one of the things I feared, was feeling vulnerable. And it's very difficult right now because we're feeling vulnerable on a lot of fronts, health-wise, politically wise. And it's difficult to be strong on all those fronts at all times.
Well,
It's
Debbie,
like-
is that when you go into your persuasive mood, when you know that this person don't have facts?
Yes.
Okay.
Well-
Yes, I'm guilty of that, very guilty of that.
Yeah, I'm guilty of having made my 14-year-old listen to a 47-minute podcast full of facts. It was not persuasive.
It strikes me though, back to this conversation of coping mechanisms, that the desire to argue, the desire to persuade, the desire to beat them up with the facts and to email them the article that's going to completely persuade them once and for all. In a way, I wonder, that's also kind of a coping mechanism, isn't it? In the same way that withdrawing it might be, fighting, beating them over the head is a coping mechanism of the thing we're also trying to avoid. I wonder, and that is listening to the vulnerability, to your point, Debbie, being vulnerable enough to let go of the need to respond and to persuade and to fix and to solve and to correct and to listen for understanding.
Yes,
Sure, I
I
thought
agree.
the presentation was extremely well spoken, and the ability to communicate was really, your tone stays really calm. For your daughter, I would suggest have her make a list of 5 things that she needs with an in-person visit from a friend. How can she translate those into the way the world actually needs to work due to the law? And then see if she can come up with a solution and have her, her run it by you. You know what I mean? Because I see her argument. I get it. I mean, it makes sense. Like 5 years ago, she probably could have, right? So it seems unfair. But if she can make a list of 5 things, what she's looking for, translate it, I think her question's correct. It's probably a really hard line for a parent to hold, but I think it needs to be held. You know what I mean?
That's a good suggestion. Her 5 things all boil down to everybody else in our world is not as crazy as you, and they're all hanging out. What is wrong with just hanging out?
That's not fair. That's not fair.
I know it's hard.
We're starting to run down to our end of our official time here. In fact, we went over a little bit, but there's no 11 o'clock service today, so we gave ourselves a little grace. But
I have a question I want to ask us.
Go,
And I've wanted to ask us every week, and it is not for a show of hands, or it is really rhetorical, but it is in our desire to have more meaningful conversation with grace around difficult topics in our congregation. Are we only speaking with one side of the political divide? Do we have, and Chris, maybe you can answer this best, I'm truly not looking for people to volunteer their views, but I have feared we're talking to the choir. Do you think that's true, Chris?
Based on the folks on these calls, no. We've had folks from both sides of the aisles, I can tell you that.
That's good.
And I think also, though, your question is a wonderful setup for next week's final class on this, which Amy Graham is going to be offering, and that is this idea of really challenging our echo chambers, that we talk about a comfort mechanism or a coping mechanism, staying within a zone of folks so that we are all just talking to the choir all the time. That is one of the big coping mechanisms I think we have in our politics right now. And so this chapter, this willingness to check out discomfort is a perfect invitation to the next stage, which is getting out of our echo chambers. So that's a wonderful question, and one that we'll continue next week. And by the way, for those who want to stay on the call for a few minutes, we'll have a little afterglow, and maybe we could wrestle with that question some more. But I'll bring the forum to its official conclusion, and those who need to go can go. But before we leave, let's all just give Hunter another round of thank you, visually or audibly, or however you want to do it. Thank you very much, Hunter. That was wonderful. And,
I think that the best end to it is if I read this little chat from Eric, who says, "Is it not amazing that Jesus managed to be confrontational and truthful, yet utterly vulnerable at all times and to the end?" Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, that's made him one of a kind.
That's a perfect last word. Thank you, folks. We'll see you next week. And for those who want to hang on the call, you're welcome to do so. And Hunter said she'll hang around and answer and give you more of her wisdom.
Will you stay on as well, Father Chris?